I think increasingly we're seeing commentators going, let's sell state-owned entities. They're failing. They're too big. They don't know what we want. They don't respond to market signals because government pumps more money in whenever they need it. Let's sell the SOEs. Let's get rid of BEE. It's not achieving its purpose, and it's causing all kinds of damage.
How do we empower individuals in South Africa to achieve economic prosperity? Well, one school of thought that may have some application in the South African context is the Austrian School of Economics. Joining me to discuss is Ian Macleod. Ian Macleod, welcome to the show.
Hi, David. Thank you. Good to be here.
All right. So, Ian, you're quite difficult to categorize, which I think is a good thing. You're involved somewhat in academia. You also do a lot of writing. Could you explain a bit about your background?
Yeah, I don't think there is a name for what I do. I've studied various things, including business and journalism. I've had multiple careers, including writing sports features for the likes of Sports Illustrated, some time in academia, some consulting at a big four firm, and on my own account. So I'm somewhat of a pracademic, if you like, recovering journalist, and to some extent an economist.
All right, Ian, well, let's delve into this topic of Austrian economics. Could you explain, for those who are not familiar, what is Austrian economics and how is it different to other schools of economic thought?
Sure. I think the best way to start the explanation is with a quote I came across recently from David, a chap called Todd Buchholz. He says, market competition leads a self-interested person to wake up in the morning, look outside at the earth, and produce from its raw materials not what he wants, but what others want. Not in the quantities he prefers, but in the quantities his neighbors prefer. And not at the price he dreams of charging, but at a price reflecting how much his neighbors value what he has done. Now that sounds very collectivist as I read it out, but as you'll tell from that quote, Austrian school economics is very much probably the ultimate free market school of economics. The focus is on the freedom of the individual and the way that free people acting on their own with some rules produce the best outcome for a society and for an economy. So I call it the original Ubuntu, in fact. Many of its principles are very much mainstream. Austrian economists have contributed to the stuff we all learn in economics: supply and demand, utility, subjective utility. So we can contrast it with most starkly with government planning. Your Austrian economist is very skeptical about whether governments are good at planning and whether they have the right intentions when they try to do planning.
Okay, so there's a kind of healthy suspicion of statism and state intervention, but then also on the positive side, there's this celebration of individual agency, individual choices, that individuals acting in a market economy without interference, there's a kind of a process of price discovery that happens. So market signals that kind of get sent between various actors. And when the state gets involved, you have a signal distortion. Is that a fair representation?
Absolutely. And I think there are two things to add to that. One is one example is your rent control. The state often comes in and they want to be good for the people, and they impose rent controls. Sounds very nice. Sounds very nice for people who will benefit, and it might even sound like it's taking back some money from greedy people. In fact, we know what happens in the end. It limits investment in housing, and housing gets worse, and there's a lack of investment in new housing stock. prices go up. So when you step in, or when a big central body steps in and breaks that signaling system that you mentioned, long term, it's worse for everyone. And the term that I like, I think it was from Mises who uses the term, is malinvestment. When a government steps in and makes things too cheap or too expensive, investments that shouldn't be made get made, and investments that should get made don't get made.
Okay, and that doesn't mean necessarily that individual actors are always going to be entirely rational, or that their investment decisions are necessarily going to produce winning outcomes. I mean, the kind of failure of a particular firm or an individual is actually a signal in itself, right? Because others will observe what is happening and act accordingly.
Yeah, it's not a perfect system. No system is, and absolutely, businesses have to fail. They will fail. They must fail. It's terrible. It's terrifying. I've got a small business that I'm starting, and it's frightening. Long term, it has to happen. Those signals have to happen, as you say. They guide other people, and they guide collective action.
Yeah, and even very successful firms, like if you think of Google, when they invested in Google Glass, everyone was talking about the glass holes wearing these contraptions, and the market just simply rejected it, and they had to just mothball the project. But if you think of augmented reality, that's still kind of around, and the market is trying to figure out like how to productize this and how to make it profitable. But part of that failure again is how you make improvements and how you discover good products. Okay, so I mean, what else could you tell us about Austrian economics? Because I mean, I think one of the prevailing figures in particularly 20th century economics is John Maynard Keynes, and Keynesianism, the doctrine that he put forward, seems to predominate in particularly government departments, national treasuries, and central banks as well. Could you describe Keynesianism as a kind of a counterpoint to Austrian School?
Yeah, and I'd agree. I think Keynesian thinking does dominate treasuries and central banks, and I think both of these schools of thought are complex, and they agree in places and disagree in others. I think the essential disagreement is where the unit of economic power. And as we said, Austrian school economists very much favor, or very much focus on the power of the individual. Keynesian thinking focuses on the power of central banks and treasuries, and they have a great deal of faith in the ability of a central bank or a treasury to perform phenomenal calculations, to gather all the data that they need to make those calculations, to have the right intentions and spirit, to analyze those and act on them in the right way, and the ability to do all of that in order to tweak and manage the economy. I think your Austrian thinker says it's wrong, and it starts to sound a bit like hubris. So your central bankers are the guys who we hear around about monetary policy committee meeting time. It seems like every business news update is talking about what the central bank is going to do to interest rates in order to manage the economy. What people are forecasting ahead. There are huge numbers of mathematical models that try and forecast where the economy is going, how much money we should put into the economy in order to manage output. And your Austrian says we can't really do that. The best way to do this, to manage this, is to have some basic rules, but we're not smart enough. We're not altruistic enough. Individual action, albeit with some pain, with hard work, with risk, with some failure, is the best we've got.
Okay, so if Keynes was joining our podcast conversation today, he would say, well, sometimes business is reluctant to make investments because they're perhaps overly cautious. They see maybe recessionary conditions, so they sit on their capital. And what you need is for an actor like the state, which has great power and ability to marshal resources, to kind of come in and make some initial investments that kind of ignite economic activity, that, to use Keynes's phrase, awaken the animal spirits in investors. But what would you say to that argument?
I'd say, John, I don't think I'm dogmatic enough to reject Keynesianism outright and always. I can see some benefits. I think overall it's not the right approach, but to give credit, I think, for example, coming out of the Great Depression, you can achieve some good results by central bank pumping out money, the fiscus pumping out money. It can have that effect of improving business confidence and stimulating the economy. But I think we can go back to that distortion we spoke about earlier. The best signal are the signals that organically, if you like, emerge from the billions and billions of decisions that all of us that get made across, the 8 billion people on the planet every day, on what to buy, how much of it, how hard to work, where to work, what business to start. And so I would say long term, you can't beat the market. Nothing can beat the market. Long term, you're up against a force of nature that we can't out-calculate and we can't out-muscle.
Yeah, and I think in many respects, what we're dealing with here is an information problem. That the state has certain limitations in terms of its institutional capacity, right? Even in developed countries, right? There's just going to be limits to what they know. And an absurd example is looking at the Soviet Union, where there were committees that were staffed by highly intelligent actuaries who were, every year they would try to make a prediction about how many shoes were required for the whole of the Soviet Union. And they'd come up with a number. Okay, like this year it's going to be 11.5 million shoes that we're going to produce. But every year there were either shortages or surpluses, right? Because maybe that winter it was slightly colder and you would need more heavy duty work boots, and maybe the next season would be slightly warmer and more sandals would be needed. But it's really impossible for even the most enlightened bureaucrats or planners to make those projections. Markets, on the other hand, might be some small lags here and there, but they kind of respond to fluctuations in supply and demand.
Absolutely. There's the speed, as you mentioned. We are making these decisions throughout the day, every day. A government is collecting them as they go along. At best, it's months old when they get it. And then they're forecasting into the future, making decisions they can't change for months, years maybe. There's the sheer amount of data. They cannot hope to collect and then properly analyze all of our tastes, all of our goals, our preferences, our fears. And we could even do the thought experiment. What if they did have all this perfect data? It came in magically through smartphones. They don't have the calculation ability, the models to crunch the numbers and make the decisions. And then the next one is do they have their hearts in the right place? Or perhaps let's be more economical. What are their motives and intentions? It's a government or a bank staffed by individuals. What are their motivations? They don't overlap. They don't match each citizen's motivation. And so, yeah, deeply flawed on the information side of things.
Yeah, and Thomas Sowell said that you must judge a policy by its outcomes, not by its intentions. I think it's always good to bear that in mind. Yeah, and like you say, I mean, the state is not completely neutral, right? There's always perhaps a specific agenda that is trying to be advanced, represent a certain set of interests. And often when people say to me, "Oh, the state must do X to solve Y problem," I usually say, "Well, substitute the word state with the politicians that you know operating on a 5-year election cycle. Do you still want to give them that power? Do you still want to give them that level of discretion?" Usually that kind of changes the view somewhat. So I think, maybe economists make this mistake of kind of assuming that the state is necessarily going to always have the best interests at heart. It's always going to act fairly and neutrally and judiciously, but it's often just not the case. There are very specific interests that it represents.
Yes, it's probably similar to the central bank trying to forecast interest rates and output and so on. Here and there, they may hit it on the head and get it okay. You occasionally do get a political dispensation that does some good things, but it's almost like playing roulette.
Yeah, and I think I've personally had a very interesting journey because I studied politics at university and did my master's. I'm kind of obsessed with party politics and political institutions. And then when I left university, I took a very deep interest in economics. I thought, this is the answer. You just need the right economic policies and a full understanding of the models and so on, and then you'll be able to implement the right policies. But now I've come around to the other side where I realize, well, actually, a lot of this is about contest for power and kind of ideological conflicts as well. And that policy is really downstream from ideology. It's not just this kind of technocratic exercise of kind of choosing the right policies, even though I do recognize the impact that policy has. All right, well, enough about me. Let's get back to Austrian economics. So, one of the things that you mentioned, and I should state that you've written a very interesting article on the Daily Friend, which I will link to in the show notes. But would you explore the role of central banks? And you mentioned central banks recently. And, what role, if any, do central banks play in this Austrian conceptualization of economics? And we're obviously, when we say Austrian, we're not meaning literally just whatever comes out of Austria, but the kind of school of philosophy.
Yes, yeah, probably worth mentioning. Yeah, it's the school that it did emerge from the University of Vienna, but I don't want to suggest all Austrians are Austrian school thinkers. So I think, as it stands, central banks are almost universally, some are more interventionist than others, but almost universally there is a sense that the role for the central bank is to nudge the economy, if not more than nudge. We look to them at monetary policy meeting time to fix the economy, to create jobs, and I think that is entirely misplaced. People going out doing things with a framework, but just individuals doing things create jobs, and so I think that the central bank, I think there are some legitimate roles that they perform, stabilizing or rather just managing sort of certain functions in the economy. But I think this role of a central bank as a behemoth, benevolent body that can set reserve ratios and perform open market operations and set the interest rate, I think we should move away from that. They don't know how to do it. Is the short answer.
Okay, well, I'm always a bit reluctant to throw mud at the South African Reserve Bank because it's one of the few institutions in our economic policy environment that is well run and seems to be a bit of a bastion of common sense. But what you're critiquing essentially is the very notion of central banks, that you have one central actor that determines the price of capital and interest rates. But in the South African context, I mean, I've often heard Lesitja Kganyago, the Reserve Bank governor, saying, well, we need to be cautious about putting too much power in the hands of the central bank to determine what happens in the economy. And I think he has a very strong point there. He can only do so much, him and his colleagues on the MPC. What is your reflection of the kind of overall role of the SARB here and our monetary policy framework?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I tend to think, thank goodness, often when I hear about a SARB action. Good. They maintain some sanity in an often strange world. And I think, yes, without being, there's no sense being dogmatic and an activist economist, I don't think. I think being pragmatic is often more sensible. And I think the SARB has, to a pretty good extent, maintained independence. We know the disaster that happens when a central bank is influenced or captured even by politics or animal spirits, if you like. And I think their moves, I'm not somebody who sits and pores over central bank decisions, but I think their rate changes tend to be modest, and that's something to be thankful for, I think.
And the bank is independent in a constitutional sense, and it has its own authority. Although I stand under correction, but I think the president does appoint the central bank governor, right?
I think that's right. I'm not very close to that structure, but I tend to agree it's done pretty well staying independent. Yes, under I'm sure massive pressure.
And one of its mandates is obviously inflation targeting. That seems very important. There's a band between 3% and 6%. I don't understand why there's a band. They should just have a target. But what about this very notion of targeting inflation? Do you think that is something that the central bank should be doing?
I think going back to Austrian principles, I think central banks tend to be the cause of inflation. And in fact, we're better off relying on what we spoke about a little bit earlier, signals, organic signals in the economy, and people responding, and avoiding things like something we've seen a lot of in recent years: quantitative easing, central banks and bourses pumping out money, like the American, for example, the American. I forget the term, payments for people to stay at home during COVID. That's what causes inflation. So I think we're better off defending against the things that cause it than using a central bank tools to try and manage it.
Right. Well, when we look at the last 15 years or so, particularly in the United States, we see the US Federal Reserve kind of taking on this increasingly interventionist role. And, that goes all the way back, I would say, probably to about 2001 in the recession there, as you point out in your article. And just basically that monetary policy was too loose. They were trying to overstimulate the economy. And this created this kind of buildup of asset bubbles and malinvestment, basically. So, where there was a company that maybe would not have been viable under normal market conditions, suddenly, because of all this excess capital sloshing around in the system, it would have gone to a company like that. And then there was obviously everything with the collateralized debt obligations and the various securitizations that were all very opaque. And then 2008, the whole system kind of came tumbling down. So now many people would point to this and say, well, this is what happens when you have excessive, unbridled, unregulated capitalism. But I kind of saw it a bit differently. I saw it actually, the institutional setup created conditions for this to happen, that there was this market signal distortion that happened and this malinvestment, to use your terms. And, as you point out in your article, Ben Bernanke recently received the Nobel Prize, and he was the central bank, the Reserve Bank federal chair during the crisis 2008 to about 2014. And you're rather impolite about him. You said that It's like awarding the arsonist the prize for putting out the fire that he started. Why are you so mean to Mr. Bennett?
I think us economists like to be competitive in our language, politely competitive, I think. Yes, I think you correctly highlight the opacity, and I think that that's something that gets put at the feet of the free marketeers. But in fact, free marketeers are very cognizant of the need for information. The distortion that happens from opacity is something that an Austrian economist is happy to have an institution come in to deal with, so that one side doesn't have an unfair amount of information compared to the other. And then, yes, I think you highlight the quantitative easing. That just means there's too much money being pumped out. It distorts signals and malinvestment, coupled with the moral hazard of some of these big institutions pretty much knowing that they're too big to fail. And Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, etc. If I've got those, if I've paired them correctly.
Yeah, there were implicit guarantees given to financial institutions that they could get involved in some of these exotic options, and then actually that created that moral hazard, like you said. Maybe they took excessive risks because they knew that the downside wasn't that great.
Yep, more market distortions.
Right. Well, I'd like to just turn the lens on yourself there, Ian, more personally. I mean, how did you arrive at some of these conclusions? What was your journey? Because when I look at the curricula of economics departments at mainstream universities, I don't see much Austrian economics. I mean, you did say some of the kind of economics 101 principles do draw from the Austrian tradition. But, I wouldn't say that we're producing an army of Austrian acolytes in South Africa and also abroad.
Yeah, so my undergraduate was business science down at UCT, your alma mater as well, I think. And so I did lots of economics. I didn't proceed to honors, but I think Austrian school economics, apart from those very mainstream principles, it's the type of thing that gets mentioned here and there. There was a course I did on the history of economic thought, where you sort of plow through various schools that have emerged over the years, and Austrian school popped up there. But again, I also did a master's at Gibbs recently, and they're again very much mainstream. And I draw from that and from other experiences that universities, certainly in South Africa and probably throughout the world, I'm sure with lots of exceptions, Austrian thinking is considered heterodox. So the process I went through is really one of self-discovery of the school. And I'm at quite an exciting phase, really. I've gone through a lot of it, and I'm now at the point where I've got to sit down and read the original treatises of the great thinkers, which is quite cool. So I think it's really a case of, and I think that for most people who join this sort of fraternity, it tends to be through your own exploration.
Okay, and obviously some of those thinkers are Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich von Hayek. So quite a lot of big names there. All right, so, but now some of my audience, most of whom are in South Africa, probably wondering, well, okay, this is all very good and well, but how does it apply to the South African context? And maybe we could look at some of areas of economic policy in South Africa that have been influenced perhaps by Keynesianism or much more overtly socialist orientation. And maybe we could together just try to explain how an Austrian approach might solve some of these problems. The most obvious one is unemployment in South Africa. I mean, we have so many people out of jobs, at least on the official definition. What would an Austrian say about South Africa's high unemployment rates?
We can go back to fundamentals. Long-term, free markets with some rules, people getting up every day thinking what am I going to do today that's best for me and my family? You dive into an economy, and with obvious exceptions, you tend to do things that are best for the economy. And we've had phenomenal market distortions. One I raise quite often is BEE, and I think that's just a market distortion that it hits all those points that Austrian school economists shudder at. It's a big central bureaucracy that decides something and lays down a rule which is implemented and enforced by the state's monopoly on violence. And I think all of this adds up to well, we can go back to the others: excessive taxation, poor government spending on the wrong things, on unproductive things. And I think all of this over many years accumulates to the general stagnation and terrible unemployment figures. You did look for solutions, and I think we're starting to see the light, I think. And I think many people are calling for solutions. They may not seat them in any particular school of thought, but I think increasingly we're seeing commentators going, let's sell state-owned entities. They're failing. They're too big. They don't know what we want. They don't respond to market signals because government pumps more money in whenever they need it. Let's sell the SOEs. Let's get rid of BEE. It's not achieving its purpose, and it's causing all kinds of damage. And I think a nice body of solutions lies in something out of I think it's AfriForum? No, Sakelige. They call it state-proofing your business. And I think this is quite a practical individual level solution that all of us can apply. And I spoke to their chief economist recently, Russell Lamberti, another product of the University of Cape Town economics department, and asked him for some of these practical guidelines. And it's quite simple. One, he recommends join or start a local business forum or guild. Localization, decentralization is endorsed by Austrian School economics. It brings decision-making closer to the individual, further away from the lumbering bureaucrat. Escape Black economic empowerment. Sakelige has, based on some rulings and some legal opinions, they reckon we have a lot of scope now to escape BEE in our businesses. And then there are a number of even smaller things. We can join Neighborhood Watch. This came out of a friend of mine who I quote anonymously in my piece. I can announce his name is Konstantinos Papadopoulos. He had to state-proof his family business just in recent years. And some simple advice: avoid businesses where you need a government permit because it's going to be slow and you're relying on the government to even get it. Look for global sources of income and hire based on merit. So I think there are lots of things we can do to retake power as individual economic actors.
Yeah, I think another thing I would add to that is litigation. I mean, obviously the courts, there are certain limitations, but that matter that you referred to with regards to Sakelige's achievements with BE, it basically got the component of pre-qualification criteria in preferential procurement policy kind of scrapped. So I think that was a very important victory. And if you think of the leverage of something like that, I mean, how much would that litigation have cost? Probably a few $100,000. The amount of capital that is unlocked in the country is orders of magnitude larger. And yeah, I mean, I think also policy think tanks, advocacy organizations, You mentioned AfriForum, Institute of Race Relations, organizations like OUTA, even small, very policy-focused organizations like an Sussman Foundation. All of these play a role also in dispersing power as well. And I think maybe in South Africa we've gotten used to kind of delegating policy making and decision making to government, and then appealing to government to make certain policy choices. But actually, we can create policy, we can propose alternatives, and also engage in conflict with the state, and to achieve certain policy outcomes, rather than just kind of engaging in a kind of a weird social compacting kind of exercise.
Yeah, I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to the likes of the entities you mentioned.
And I'm going to be joining another one, which is the Free Market Foundation. Shouldn't neglect to
absolutely. Let's add them. We owe all of them a great debt for raising funding, undergoing litigation, and I watched for OUTA, for example. They had that recent victory regarding the e-tolls. Sakaliga had one recently, which you mentioned, and I think, I suppose my approach tends to be that I know stuff and I write stuff, and that's kind of my contribution. But I think these organizations that actually go present a powerful argument and in court, I think that is, and that's something we can all contribute to. I think if you have a little bit of cash that you want to put into something good, charity can achieve some things. But I think, if you look at it through the lens of the Austrian School economist, you're going to do a lot more good directing your money at some litigation that's going to free up the economy.
All right. So one of the underlying themes of the Austrian School, and also of this show, not accidentally, is this idea of decentralization and the distribution of power down and out, rather than concentrating it in the hands of politicians or civil servants or bureaucrats. Why do you think this idea of decentralization is an important kind of conceptual foundation for Austrian economics?
Think of the most simple human nature. If I believe I can go to a neighborhood meeting and have my say, and people might just listen and something will get done, good chance I'll do it. If I look at a a session of parliament, there's nothing I can do really. I'd rather sit back and respond, just accept whatever they do, whatever they hand down. And I think that gels with the Austrian emphasis on individual freedom. I think the closer we get to the individual, the better. And so I do mention Cape, where the Western Cape, potential for Western Cape independence. I think more independence is almost always a better thing. Practically, I think that's showing itself to be the case in the Western Cape. Yeah, and I think it goes down to just that very simple notion that we take care of things that we own. We're more likely to take care of our own garden and the sidewalk outside our house than to contribute to a body far away who promises to come over and cut the lawn.
Yeah, and then there's also the free rider problems, the tragedy of the commons, that if nobody is individually responsible for something, then they kind of abdicate the responsibility, and then you have this kind of decay. So actually having a society of empowered individuals actually produces, on aggregate, better outcomes.
Absolutely. I couldn't have put it better.
All right. Well, Ian, as we draw this conversation to a close, maybe you could offer some final thoughts about how people, individuals who might not necessarily be economists, could give expression to some of the ideas that we have discussed today. You have mentioned state-proofing your business and so on. What about the kind of the philosophy, the way in which you make decisions in the world, that you allocate capital, or just the way that you live your life? Can there be any lessons from the Austrian school?
Well, I think to be true to the Austrian spirit, I would say just you do you. I certainly recommend that reading up on the Austrian approach is a good thing to add to your to anyone's intellectual toolbox on economics and philosophy. Certainly a good thing if it's foreign to you.
And Ian, where would you recommend starting in terms of reading material?
The best thing is just to jump online and Google it and dive into a few sources. I'm not sure I've come across any particularly great intro text, but it's all out there. All the information you need is there. Something
I'm quite fond of is Russ Roberts of Econ Talk. He created a video which was a Keynes Hayek epic rap battle, which is a very entertaining primer for the discussion that we've had today.
Yes, let me correct my answer. That's it. the Hayek Keynes rap battle is the starting place. Yes.
Well, brilliant. Well, I think that's a good place for people to start, and that's also a good place for us to end. But Ian Macleod, I wanted to thank you very, very much for coming on the show, and hoping to have more discussions like this with you in future.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, David.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also leave your thoughts down in the comments section. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do leave a review there as well. Just a quick housekeeping note that this will be the penultimate episode of the Solutions podcast for the year. I'm going to be putting the show on hold in December and figuring out what I want to do with this platform in the new year. My name is David Ansara. Until we speak again, take care.